Hi, this is Joe Rabel. We're going to spend some time talking about the S&P 500 chart, and then we're also going to go into some individual stocks based on some requests from subscribers. So I'm going to go through and analyze the stocks, give you a read based on the monthly, working its way down to the hourly, kind of show you how I go about doing that. What I'm doing to start, I want to show you, I've got a slightly different layout than I've done in past videos. I've got 4 charts up. This is my stock grid, as the way I would call it. On the bottom left, I've got a monthly. The bottom right is a weekly chart. Upper right is a daily, and then upper left is an hourly. I read somewhere years ago, the way your brain works, it's good to look at stocks or charts in this way in a counterclockwise fashion. I start with the bottom left because I like to have the monthly on the left and the weekly on the right, and those two work together. And then if I want to look at the next 2 time frames, I can look at a weekly on the right, and then above it I've got the daily, and then I've got the daily and the hourly side by side up top. So it's just the way I've done it for years, and I think, again, get used to looking at charts in a certain way. Use the same moving averages. Have your moving average, have your indicators looking the same. And I like to have them look the same on all the time frames. I don't switch based on one time frame versus another. I like the time frames are the key, and making sure you get somewhere around 1 to 5, 1 to 6 to be the ratio for one time frame to the next. And I think if you do that, the methods that I'm using, I think will work very well. The starting point is always the monthly, as I've shown here. So I'm going to get into the daily or the S&P chart. I do want to quickly just mention that, since I'm going to be talking about stocks today, this channel and the website are for educational purposes only. It's not intended to be used as a complete source of information on any particular company. I'm only giving you the technical picture based on multiple time frames and momentum. So any individual who chooses to invest in securities should do so with caution. And investing is very speculative, carries risk. You can lose your money, some or all. Just want to make sure that's crystal clear. Let's go and look at the S&P chart. I'm going to pull that up now. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, guys. And if you're already a subscriber, if you like what you see, hit the like button so I know what type of content to provide. So bottom left, I've got the monthly chart. And so the S&P, again, we really haven't changed that much from the last time. We've made a pretty good move off of support into resistance. We're sitting right, we got through the 50% retracement. We haven't exploded through it. I thought if we got through the 50% retracement, we might carry all the way up to the 62% number. Haven't quite done that. Today, obviously not a real good day. Let me zoom in a little bit on the daily chart up here. It's a negative day, but if you notice, it's not a big wide range day. It's not showing a huge amount of selling from the open. It had a bad open, and then it kind of just drifted. It was kind of drifting around all day. Not a lot of follow through. A little bit easier to see on the hourly chart. It actually came down a little bit. It came down a little bit and then rallied up, and then ended up closing the day kind of on a down note. But we're still above the trend line that I had drawn in from the last review. And, one of the things I had mentioned is, the farther up, I've been saying this in the last couple of minutes, the farther up you push off the low, I think that provides more support underneath for when you have a decline. We haven't actually started the decline. I mentioned in the last video, I'm looking for some sign of sellers to show up where the DI line can make a negative DI. The red DI can show some really strong strength, preferably on a break of this trend line. We just haven't quite seen that yet. I think that would come in the form of a wide range bar to the downside, and then we'd be looking for some kind of a little retracement back up. One point I would want to make, we can break the trend line and still be above the 18 MA on the daily chart. And so what could play out is, if we break the trend line and maybe hold the 18 on the first try, maybe we get a little bounce, that could set up a 1-2 And then maybe the hourly has started to show some negative DI. So just kind of be on the lookout for that. It's still, it didn't actually reach into this resistance zone that I had provided on the chart, that shaded area, but it got pretty close. So I think we need to be on the lookout for some type of a retracement back down. Based on the fact that we have driven up so far off the low, I'm more inclined to believe that somewhere around the 25 to 2600 area is really where support's going to come in. If I zoom out here, I'm sort of looking at this zone now underneath. Again, somewhere around 2500, 2600. Now, if we do make it all the way up to the 618, in a lot of cases, what'll end up happening is you'll find resistance at the 618 and then support at the 382. So you could end up kind of forming a little bit of a range. When you've made this kind of a move off the low, you get a really powerful move off the bottom. A lot of times, again, we didn't hesitate really very much at the 382. We didn't really stop at the 50%. We paused a little bit. We didn't get any kind of a reversal. If we make it up to the 618, there's a pretty good chance that I think we'll at least bounce around or pull back. And I think at that point, then the 38% retracement actually provides support on a pullback. So I'm not really in the camp of the group out there. I mean, I know I've seen guys out there making some pretty big predictions of big moves to the downside. I can't believe how many down arrows I see coming off the S&P chart out there on YouTube. I don't know. I'm not in that camp right now. I'm not saying that it can't happen. I just think it's a lower probability. I think, it'd be more likely that we come down and hold it the first, maybe the 50% retracement and then work our way back up. And then if we don't get any momentum to the upside, then I could see us coming back down. Most of the time when you get this strong of a drive off the bottom, you don't just reverse right back down and go through all that. So I'm not, I'm not trying to come across as bullish or bearish. I'm just trying to look at, I'm trying to analyze what's taking place. And I think if we get sellers to show up, I think there could be a pretty decent trade to the downside. And that's kind of how I'd look at it. We're going to go into the stocks now. And, but one point I wanted to bring up, the stocks, I think the book that I wrote, it's on Amazon, $9.99. We're going to go through, analysis. I think the book can really help with the type of stuff that I'm doing. I think you can learn a lot. It'll probably speed up the process of what it would take to learn some of the things that I'm going to talk about. There's several different setup patterns and entry patterns and trigger mechanisms and all that that play a role. So I'm going to sort of go through the analysis part. And I do think it's important to understand that when you go through the trading side of things, you got to understand you have to have a methodology for getting in and getting out. That's kind of what the book is designed to do. So let's go and look at some individual stocks and just based on the request. So we're starting with Tesla, looking at the monthly. One of the things that I think is pretty important here, I want to mention this, that the earnings are scheduled to be on April 29th. I'm not a huge fan of being a trader really close to earnings. Now, again, I'm saying 429. That's based on the service that I use. They're not always correct. I've got the dates on the stocks we're going to talk about for the earnings for my service. They're saying but double check that. That's what this date is going to be, the one that I use, but they're not always right. They're right most of the time, but I just want to make that point. So anyway, Tesla, really powerful move coming through this prior high right before the market got into trouble. And if you notice, we made a really huge move. And then when the market sold off, it came back to the breakout point and held that. Notice the strength of the ADX pattern, where you've got a really strong ADX on the monthly chart. You've got a really strong ADX on the weekly chart. I'm inclined to believe that this stock wants to move higher. I just think, just based on how much volatility there is, you got to be careful. And again, you gotta have a good strategy for getting in. I personally think we could go through some form of like a consolidation pattern, like an apex forming, sort of a triangle. I would look for a setup on the daily chart on a pullback closer to the 600 zone or closer to the 18 MA. That's probably going to come in the form of a counter trend move on the hourly. So it would be the opposing trend trigger off the hourly into the daily. Again, that's out of my book. So that's kind of how I'd be viewing this. I think it's fairly bullish what's going on here. Team is the next one. A lot of strength behind this. The ADX pattern is incredibly powerful on the monthly. And if you notice, all we did was pull back to a rising 18-month line during the big, huge bear market that we had. That's a very strong sign for this stock. There weren't a lot of sellers. We're kind of neutral on the weekly chart, where you can see we've been trading back and forth above and below the 18 and the 40. I'd actually like to see a little bit more strength off the daily, or actually it's not too bad, but what we're probably going to need to do is pull back and then turn back to the upside. I just don't think it's quite ready. It's made kind of a pretty big move right now. I think if it broke out, it would probably pull back anyway. But I think this is a stock to watch. I think overall pattern is pretty constructive here. GE, go back to a video I talked about not that long ago. It was a trade. It's how to trade in a range. Because I think what's taken place here is the monthly chart looks like it's finally exhausted itself to the downside. You had a really strong bearish trend. You broke the trend line, but you're not really ready to go higher. So I would kind of view this as a range here between this area here and hopefully this zone here. Now, if I go back in time, you can see there was a pretty strong support from this area back in 2008, 2009. So I think there's a pretty good chance this is going to try and trade in a range, but we're going to need to see some improvement on the hourly. I mean, the one thing I would do is probably draw on a trend line here and look for strong positive DI on a break to the upside. And then you have some opportunity, you're probably going to have some opportunity to trade up inside the range. It could be up towards 12. I mean, there's a lot of money that could be made inside of a range in this stock. So I definitely think it's worth watching. But we're going to need to see some improvement on the shorter term timeframes. DFS has struggled. Again, remember these earnings. This has earnings in a day or two. You got to be really, really careful about trading in front of earnings. If you're going to trade longer term, you can do that through earnings, but I would rather have a cushion in the stock, meaning if I'm going to get in and I'm up 5 to 10%, even 15% or something like that, and I want to see the earnings through that, I'm okay with that. But if I just bought it and I know I've got earnings in a day or two and I don't have any profits, I'm leaving myself open to a really big potential gap down. It's not saying that it's going to happen, but it could. And in a lot of ways, it's very dangerous trading in front of earnings right now, but just because a lot of gaps, pretty significant size. So just be aware of that. As far as the chart goes, it had a really violent decline to the downside, strong momentum on both the monthly and the weekly, and it just hasn't recovered that much. So I'm inclined to want to see this at least get back up through this little area here. And if it does that, then yeah, I could see. So this will be coming up through here. And if it can do that, then you probably have some room to trade up. And again, trading in these ranges between support and resistance, pretty good money can be made, but you got to be really careful. And I wouldn't jump the gun on this because it is acting weaker than the market right now. MCK. The most important thing about MCK, in my view, is the longer-term pattern has broken its long-term downtrend. We've been forming sort of this sideways pattern for a while. It's coming down and testing the trend line again and testing support. So on a monthly chart, we've got a 1 and we've got a 2. If it can start to turn up from here, I think that's going to come in the form of strength on the weekly chart. We just haven't seen it yet. And there's no real DI strength. So I want to see this kind of push up and then maybe look to buy a pullback. If you wanted to be aggressive, you could look for strength on the daily chart and then look for a pullback off of the ADX. So I want to see a strong move to the upside with confirming ADX action and then maybe look to buy a pullback. And that would be more of an aggressive play rather than waiting for the weekly, because the weekly might take a while. NVDA has shown some really good strength. It's one of the strongest stocks out there, really. If you look at where it's been relative to the market, let me just show. This is the relative strength line. So this is how this stock is doing relative to the S&P and has been for a very long time. And even through this huge decline, it really performed way better than the S&P did. And then, one of the things I'd mention is that we've got some resistance coming up at 300. I think there's pretty good support, probably around 250. Maybe we trade a little bit in a range in the short term. We do have a month before earnings, so the possibilities are there that we could pull back. And if that's the case and we hold the 18 on the daily chart, there could be some upside to play for another move, up towards 300 again. So just kind of be on the lookout for that. Snap has earnings coming up this afternoon, I think, tomorrow. No, tomorrow. I kind of like what the short-term pattern is doing based off the daily and the hourly. The problem I've got is you just don't have enough time to really play this right now before earnings, and you're coming into a pretty good resistance zone on the weekly chart. So one of the good things is I think this is driven really far off the low. So I think there's really good support probably starting around 10. If we can push through this resistance area, then I think there's probably some pretty good upside that could develop. And then lastly, unfortunately, the RTX did not, the data on my RTX didn't work. So we're going to look at this on monthly, weekly, and daily because of the source feed. Doesn't have the interdays, but you had a pretty violent decline on the RTX. It came down to a pretty significant support area. If you look at the longer term chart, there was some pretty big support, and we've gotten a really big bounce. If you go and you look at what the resistance looks like, we've got some room, probably, maybe up towards 70, even 80 potentially, before we run into some pretty big problems. I think it's tough. I think it's more of a reversion to the mean, or probably more of a trading range pattern. And it's already made such a big move. I think I'd probably want to get some kind of a pullback before I played it up into resistance. But if we saw that on the daily chart, if this could maybe back off and consolidate a little bit, I think it could set itself up, but it's going to take a little time to do that. But right now, I would kind of view this as a trading range stock. So anyway, I hope this was helpful. Took a little bit longer than I wanted, but I think there's some pretty good information there. Let me know in your comments if you have any questions, or if you want me to handle this a little bit differently. Let me know. All right. Thank you.